The camera zooms in on a sea of faces, politicians, activists, media moguls, all staring at the stage. The air is thick with anticipation. A prestigious climate summit, the room buzzing with promises of change, solutions, and progress. Then, the moment that will define the entire event. Kamala, we've been waiting long enough. We've been patient. But waiting doesn't save a planet. Action does. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's voice rings out, sharp and defiant, cutting through the diplomatic niceties of the room. The audience gasps. This wasn't supposed to happen. There's a brief, awkward silence, but then it hits like a wave. You've had your time, now it's ours. AOC's words hang in the air, charged with fury, with urgency. Kamala Harris, standing just a few feet away, remains composed, a controlled smile on her face. But there's something different now. Her eyes flicker for a split second, betraying the shock she's trying so hard to mask. The tension is palpable. The cameras capture every moment, every breath. AOC isn't done. You preach progress, but the clock is ticking, Kamala. The earth doesn't have time for your political compromises. The room holds its collective breath. Harris's response is slow, deliberate, her voice carrying that familiar diplomatic tone. I've spent years working across the aisle to bring people together for real, sustainable change. We can't simply impose radical policies on the American people. It's about. But before Harris can finish, AOC interrupts, her voice cutting through the air with a precision that leaves no room for ambiguity. We don't need more talks, Kamala. We need action. We need leaders who don't fear change. The cameras zoom in on Kamala's face. The veneer of politeness starts to crack. She takes a deep breath, clearly preparing for a calculated response. But AOC's words have already ignited something deep within her. The crowd is in stunned silence. The entire room feels like it's on the edge of exploding. The stakes have never been higher. This isn't just a debate over climate policy, this is a confrontation for the soul of the future. And it's all unfolding live, in front of millions. What happens next could change everything. The tension in the room was more than palpable, it was a reflection of the entire nation. A crisis, years in the making, had reached its breaking point. Wildfires scorched the west, hurricanes tore through the south, and coastal cities were slowly sinking beneath rising tides. Climate change was no longer a distant theory, it was a daily reality. Yet, despite the growing destruction, the political establishment seemed stuck in a loop of inaction. Kamala Harris had built her career on being a bridge, someone who could bring all sides together. She advocated for compromise, for incremental steps, for a pragmatic approach that she believed would win over the middle of America. But in the eyes of many, her moderation was becoming synonymous with stagnation. The urgency of the crisis wasn't matched by the urgency in her policies. Bills were passed, debates had been held, but the real change people demanded was nowhere in sight. And then there was AOC. A fierce, unapologetic voice from the new wave of progressives, young, diverse, and increasingly frustrated with the slow grind of traditional politics. For AOC, the stakes couldn't have been higher. She knew that her generation would inherit a planet either ravaged by climate catastrophe or struggling to heal under a broken system. Her message was simple, yet radical: there is no time for middle ground. We need drastic action, and we need it now. The debate between Harris and AOC wasn't just about policies, it was about two competing visions for the future. Kamala, the seasoned politician who had played the game for decades, believed in a system that could still be nudged toward progress through negotiation. She wanted to reform the system, not overhaul it. She believed that incremental change was better than no change at all. AOC, on the other hand, had no patience for the game. She wasn't interested in negotiating with oil giants or appeasing centrist voters who still doubted the science. Climate change, to her, wasn't a debate, it was a crisis that demanded immediate, uncompromising action. Her Green New Deal wasn't just a policy proposal, it was a call to arms, a bold manifesto for a radical reshaping of society. In the weeks leading up to this moment, public opinion had been shifting. More and more, Americans were waking up to the fact that they were living through a planetary emergency. And as the reality of climate destruction became undeniable, frustration mounted. The people who had put their faith in Washington to act were growing impatient. Young activists, climate scientists, and even some moderate voters were demanding more than just words. Polls showed overwhelming support for bolder climate action. Yet, politicians like Kamala Harris, who had long relied on the centrist playbook, found themselves increasingly out of step with the urgent demands of their own base. Their carefully crafted policies seemed to fall flat in the face of the magnitude of the crisis. AOC, who had always been a lightning rod for controversy, had become a champion for the disillusioned. Her followers were ready to take on the status quo, to break down the barriers that had held progress back for so long. And here, in front of a global audience, was her chance to make her case. But this wasn't just about policy, it was about power. The debate between Kamala and AOC wasn't just a clash of personalities or political stances, it was a battle for the future of the Democratic Party itself. AOC's call for radical change stood in stark contrast to Kamala's measured, cautious approach. The outcome of this debate would set the tone for the next generation of leadership in America. The pressure was mounting. Could Kamala, the seasoned leader, change course fast enough to meet the moment? Or would AOC's fiery rhetoric and unrelenting vision inspire a political revolution? The political landscape was about to shift. The question was, who would define it? And how far would the battle between pragmatism and progressivism go? What was at stake was more than just the climate, it was the very soul of the nation's future. Kamala Harris had always been the embodiment of political ambition, the face of a new, diverse generation rising through the ranks of American politics. She broke barriers, yes, but she also learned quickly how to navigate the complex web of power and compromise that Washington demanded. From her time as California's Attorney General to her tenure as a U.S. Senator, Kamala had cultivated an image as a pragmatic leader who understood the art of the deal. She knew how to balance competing interests, how to keep the peace, and how to secure legislative victories, even if those victories weren't always groundbreaking. Her rise was swift, but it was built on a foundation of calculated moderation. Kamala Harris was a Democrat with roots in both the establishment and the grassroots. She made her mark on issues like criminal justice reform and women's rights, gaining respect from centrist voters and party insiders. Yet, as she transitioned into the role of vice president, a position often defined by compromise and negotiation, her stance on climate change became the subject of intense scrutiny. Kamala wasn't an environmentalist in the same way some of her more radical colleagues were. She wasn't ready to burn down the system, she believed in working within it. She didn't believe in revolutionary change but rather in incremental shifts that could gain bipartisan support. Her climate plan was a blend of compromise, a little something for everyone, or so she thought. She was proud of her climate policies, which focused on reducing carbon emissions, investing in clean energy technologies, and encouraging green job growth. But these were policies that often bent to the will of corporate interests. Kamala's bipartisan approach meant that she had to court the support of industry giants, oil companies, big utility firms, and even some tech behemoths. They weren't easy allies, but they were allies nonetheless, and she knew they were crucial to passing any meaningful legislation. Her critics, especially those on the progressive left, didn't see it that way. To them, Kamala was a product of the very system that had allowed climate change to spiral out of control. They saw her as a leader who chose to preserve the status quo, who allowed corporations to profit from the destruction of the planet, all while wearing the mask of reform. Her decision to collaborate with industry giants, many of whom were notorious for blocking more ambitious climate actions, was viewed as a betrayal. AOC, in particular, had little patience for this type of compromise. To her, the climate crisis wasn't an issue to be negotiated over a fancy dinner table with oil executives. It wasn't something to be smoothed over with vague promises of future action. The crisis was here, and it was devastating the most vulnerable communities, especially those in her own district. While Kamala met with big donors, AOC rallied in the streets with activists. While Kamala spoke of gradual change, AOC talked about a Green New Deal that would revolutionize the entire economy in one bold stroke. Kamala's political team tried to spin her climate efforts in the best light possible. They pointed to the increasing investments in clean energy, the ambitious carbon reduction goals, and the expansion of green jobs. They claimed that her approach was pragmatic because it could actually be passed into law. But to those who saw the disaster unfolding in real time, the wildfires, the droughts, the floods, Kamala's plan felt like a slow-motion response to a crisis that required immediate action. Her cautious approach had earned her respect from centrist voters, but it was increasingly alienating the very activists who once saw her as an ally. The youth vote, which had propelled her into office, was now disillusioned. They watched as their future crumbled, and they couldn't reconcile her rhetoric with her actions. Kamala had tried to stay above the fray, working to keep the peace between business interests and climate advocates. But it wasn't working anymore. Her carefully balanced approach was looking more like indecision, more like inaction in the face of a disaster. And there was something else at play, something unspoken. Kamala had long been a proponent of coalition building, a voice of reason in the middle of a polarized political system. But as the climate crisis intensified, it became clear that the center wasn't going to save the planet. Compromise was no longer an option. Radical change was necessary, but Kamala's reliance on consensus building was becoming more and more of a liability. Her attempts to maintain control over the narrative were faltering. It was no longer about protecting the middle ground, it was about protecting a dying world. For Kamala, the political game had always been one of timing. She had learned how to wait, to play the long game. But now, time was running out. The ground she had staked her career on, the center, was crumbling beneath her. What had once been considered moderation was now viewed by many as an impediment to real progress. She was too entrenched in the old ways, too afraid of upsetting the powerful corporate interests that had helped her climb to the top. For AOC, Kamala's reluctance to confront the system head-on was the ultimate betrayal. To her, Kamala wasn't just out of touch, she was part of the problem. The lack of urgency in Kamala's climate approach wasn't just frustrating, it was dangerous. It was a betrayal of the millions of Americans, particularly young people and marginalized communities, who had trusted her to do what was necessary. In their eyes, Kamala had become the embodiment of a political establishment too slow to react, too afraid to challenge the status quo. And that wasn't something they could afford anymore. Kamala's moderation had served her well in the past, but the climate crisis was no longer something that could be put off for another day. The pressure was building, and soon, there would be no hiding from it. The question now was whether Kamala could evolve fast enough to meet the moment, or if she would continue to dance around the issue, maintaining control over a narrative that no longer fit the reality of the world. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was never supposed to be here. She wasn't born into privilege, nor did she inherit a seat at the table. She grew up in the Bronx, where the odds were always stacked against her. Her father, a small business owner, died when she was just a teenager, leaving her family struggling to make ends meet. Her mother, a housekeeper, worked tirelessly to support them both. Alexandria knew hardship intimately, what it felt like to be overlooked, to have doors slammed in your face simply because you came from the wrong zip code. But that adversity never dulled her sense of purpose, instead, it ignited a fire within her. She went to Boston University, graduating with a degree in economics and international relations. But when she returned home, she realized the world she had left behind hadn't changed much. The same people who had been forgotten, left behind by society, were still struggling. It wasn't just a problem of income, it was systemic. It was the fact that entire communities of color, like the one she came from, were treated as expendable. That anger and frustration propelled her into the fight for a better world. Alexandria wasn't just angry, she was determined to change the narrative, to give voice to the voiceless. Her journey into politics wasn't a slow climb up the ladder of institutional power. It was a sudden, seismic shift. When she ran for Congress in 2018, she was a 28-year-old bartender with no political pedigree. She challenged Joe Crowley, the fourth-ranking Democrat in the House, and the odds were overwhelmingly against her. She had no money, no endorsements, and no political machine behind her. But what she had was something the establishment didn't: authenticity, passion, and a vision that resonated deeply with the progressive base. AOC's campaign wasn't just about winning, it was about shaking up the system. Her message was clear: the status quo wasn't working. She ran on a platform of radical change, pushing policies that would dismantle the systems of oppression holding back so many. Her version of the future was one that embraced bold, transformative action. And nowhere was this more apparent than in her unwavering call for climate action. The Green New Deal was her crown jewel, a visionary plan that would reshape the entire economy by addressing climate change and economic inequality simultaneously. It wasn't just a policy proposal, it was a revolution in how America thought about its future. AOC didn't just want to fight climate change, she wanted to build a new, sustainable economy that prioritized people over profit, justice over corporate greed. The Green New Deal wasn't just an environmental policy, it was a framework for a new way of life. For AOC, the urgency of climate action wasn't just a political stance, it was personal. It was the future of her generation that was at stake. The planet she would inherit, the world her future children might grow up in, was being destroyed by a system that prioritized short-term gains over long-term survival. This wasn't just a political fight, it was a fight for the very survival of the planet, for justice for the marginalized, and for the dignity of future generations. But AOC's rise wasn't without its challenges. The political machine wasn't ready for someone like her. Her ideas were considered radical by many, even in her own party. The Green New Deal, a policy that called for nothing less than a complete overhaul of America's energy system, was seen as too ambitious, too expensive, and, in the eyes of many, impossible to implement. The establishment didn't want to hear it. They didn't want to hear that it was time for a massive, systemic change, for a complete break from the status quo. Kamala Harris was one of those figures. Her measured, pragmatic approach to climate change wasn't just a matter of policy, it was an institutional mindset. She represented the system, the very politics AOC was fighting to dismantle. Kamala's incrementalism was everything AOC feared would hold back true progress. And in that stark contrast, Alexandria saw the challenge: she had to fight against not just the fossil fuel industry, but the complacency of a political class that had grown comfortable in its compromises. As AOC continued to rise in prominence, the attacks grew sharper. She was called naive, unrealistic, a wild-eyed socialist. But the more they tried to silence her, the louder her message became. The youth rallied behind her. Activists across the country saw in her the hope they had longed for, someone who wasn't afraid to challenge the powerful, to call out the lies, to demand justice for the planet. But it wasn't easy. AOC had to navigate a world that wasn't built for people like her. She faced an endless barrage of media scrutiny, racist and sexist attacks, and, more often than not, a political establishment that wasn't interested in hearing her message. She faced the pressure of knowing that every move she made was being watched, judged, and dissected. The weight of history, of the entire future, was on her shoulders. And yet, every day she stepped onto that floor, she carried it with pride. She didn't just want to be in Congress for the sake of it, she wanted to change the entire system. She wanted to tear down the structures that allowed the rich and powerful to control the fate of the many. She wasn't just a congresswoman, she was a force of nature, an unstoppable wave pushing back against decades of political inertia. Her rise was a beacon to those who had been forgotten. The working-class immigrant families, the communities of color, the young people who had been told time and time again that they were powerless, that was who AOC fought for. She wasn't just fighting for a new economy. She was fighting for dignity. And with every speech, every rally, every policy she pushed, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez reminded the world that the future was worth fighting for, no matter how hard the fight became. The establishment may have underestimated her, but they couldn't stop her. The real battle was just beginning. The climate summit had started as a forum for reasoned debate, a place where leaders from across the political spectrum could discuss solutions to the climate crisis. But with each passing moment, it was becoming clear that the conversation was rapidly descending into something far more personal. Kamala Harris, seated at one end of the stage, her calm demeanor never wavering, leaned forward into the microphone, her words measured, calculated. We must take a balanced approach. We cannot afford to lose sight of the realities on the ground. Climate change is real, but it's not a battle we can win by dividing the country. We need to bring everyone to the table, businesses, communities, local governments. Without bipartisan support, we risk making promises we can't keep. Her voice was confident, smooth, a reassuring melody of moderation. But her words, carefully chosen, did little to quell the growing restlessness in the room. The lights of the stage made her look almost untouchable, like a figure carved from stone. She was the establishment, the pragmatist, the politician who had learned long ago how to play the game. But behind that poise, something was starting to shift. AOC was not buying it. You talk about balance, Kamala, AOC shot back, her tone sharp, cutting through the room like a blade. But balance won't save us. We're not just facing an environmental crisis, we're facing a crisis of leadership. And your cautious approach? It's part of the problem. You've had the power. You've had the stage. And yet, what do we have to show for it? More delays. More talking points. More corporate handshakes. Is that really what we need right now? More time. The audience shifted in their seats, some leaning forward in anticipation. The tension in the room crackled, a growing storm ready to burst. Kamala's smile tightened just a fraction. AOC, this isn't about grandstanding. This is about getting things done. You think I haven't heard the calls for change? But if you're looking for a revolution, I'm not the one leading it. I'm trying to make sure we get something real done, something that actually has a chance of becoming law. You can't just push through sweeping reforms without bringing people along. We're a democracy, not a dictatorship. You talk about democracy, but who does it serve? AOC's voice was rising now, no longer restrained by the boundaries of decorum. The fossil fuel industry. Big corporations. They've been pulling the strings for decades, and you're still sitting down with them, trying to find common ground. Meanwhile, entire communities are drowning, burning, suffocating, and you're asking for more time to negotiate. Her words hung in the air, charged with frustration, with a rawness that struck at the heart of the issue. The audience shifted again, some nodding in agreement, others visibly uncomfortable. Kamala's calm had begun to show cracks. Kamala exhaled slowly, visibly holding back the words she desperately wanted to fire back. And what would you have us do, AOC? What's your plan? Go ahead and promise the moon, but tell us how you're going to pay for it. You're asking us to completely disrupt the economy, throw entire industries into chaos, and for what? To say you were right all along. It's not about being right, Alexandria. It's about making sure we don't tear this country apart. That's the problem, Kamala, AOC retorted, her voice dripping with disdain. You're more worried about how than if. More worried about stability than about the survival of the planet. Your cautious approach isn't leadership. It's cowardice wrapped in a power suit. The words felt like a slap, and the room went dead silent. Kamala's eyes narrowed. You think I'm a coward? Her voice was colder now, the carefully constructed calm replaced by something sharper, more dangerous. You want to talk about cowardice? I'm the one who's been working day in and day out to bring people together, to move the needle, slowly, yes, but steadily. You. AOC interrupted, her words laced with fire. I don't need to bring people together with people who have no interest in the future of this planet. Your so-called steadiness is nothing more than a slow death sentence for the environment. Every time you shake hands with fossil fuel executives, you're complicit in their greed. Every time you sit down with the CEOs of big corporations, you're telling the world that their profits matter more than our lives. You can't compromise with murderers. A gasp rippled through the room. The word murderers lingered in the air, heavier than any policy proposal. Kamala's face flushed, just for a second, but it was enough. This was no longer a battle of ideas. It was personal. Kamala rose from her seat, her voice icy now, filled with a mixture of anger and a deep, simmering frustration. You think your moral high ground gives you the right to tear down everyone who doesn't agree with you? You think it's enough to just scream louder and call everyone who doesn't fall in line a villain? You're wrong. The world doesn't work like that, Alexandria. It's not just about what we want. It's about what we can actually achieve. The words echoed in the cavernous hall, a challenge. And for a moment, it seemed as if the fight was deadlocked. But then, just as Kamala opened her mouth to continue, the screen behind them flickered. The audience turned, expecting the usual clips of the summit, statistics, progress updates, but instead, a single headline flashed across the screen. Breaking, new report shows unprecedented corporate funding behind both major parties' climate plans. The room froze. Every eye turned back to the two women on stage. The words hung in the air like a bomb. AOC's gaze never wavered from Kamala. You see, Kamala, AOC whispered, almost to herself, there it is. That's what this is really about. The revelation wasn't just a newsflash, it was the moment everything changed. The room waited, breathless. The room was still. The headline from the screen hung in the air, like an accusation. AOC stood tall, her eyes locked on Kamala, her words sharp and deliberate. She had just delivered a devastating blow, one that pierced the heart of the debate. But it wasn't just the revelation about corporate money, it was the deeper truth that Kamala had been trying so hard to avoid. The crowd murmured, the energy in the room shifting. Some of the audience members had clearly sided with AOC, while others were still clinging to Kamala's vision of moderate, incremental change. But for the first time in the debate, Kamala's calm exterior faltered. She wasn't prepared for what was coming next, and neither was the room. AOC didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her quiet, calm demeanor only amplified the power of her words. Let's talk facts, Kamala, AOC began, her voice steady but laced with urgency. Let's talk about the science, the reality of the climate crisis that we are facing right now. She turned to face the audience, engaging them, pulling them into her argument. The latest reports from the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change make it clear, we have until 2030 to reduce global carbon emissions by 45%, or we risk crossing tipping points that will make this planet uninhabitable for millions. These aren't just numbers, Kamala. These are lives. Entire communities, entire countries, will be wiped out if we don't act with urgency. The science is settled. She paused for a beat, letting the weight of her words settle in. The room was hanging on her every syllable. Your moderate approach, Kamala, your compromise, has failed to even begin to meet that deadline, AOC continued, her eyes never leaving the vice president. You've spent years negotiating with corporations, trying to get them to play nice with climate policy, but all you've done is delay real action. You talk about bipartisanship like it's some noble goal, but the truth is, it's been nothing but a cover for the very industries destroying our future. You've sat at their tables, signed their deals, and what do we have to show for it? A planet that's dying. A political system that's bought and paid for by the same people who are profiting off of this crisis. AOC's words landed like a punch to the gut. The crowd was beginning to stir, murmuring their agreement. Kamala, for the first time, seemed to lose some of her composure. She glanced down at her papers, but her hand trembled ever so slightly. A flicker of doubt passed across her face. Let's talk about the communities hardest hit by climate change, AOC continued, her voice rising now, emboldened by the momentum. Communities of color. Poor, working-class neighborhoods. These are the people who've been abandoned by the very system you champion. They didn't need more discussions, more solutions that are just recycled talking points. They needed action, yesterday. When the wildfires raged through California, when the hurricanes swept through Puerto Rico, where was the urgent response? Where was the real, transformative action? Kamala's mouth tightened, and for the briefest of moments, her eyes betrayed her. There was no denying it. The people AOC spoke of were the ones who had been left behind. Kamala's carefully crafted policies hadn't done enough to protect them. The reality of their suffering, their fight for survival, was a truth that Kamala had avoided confronting for far too long. AOC pressed on. But here's the thing, Kamala. This isn't just about facts. This is about morals. It's about justice. We talk about fairness, we talk about equality, but how can we claim to be a nation of justice when we're allowing fossil fuel companies to dictate our future? How can we talk about freedom, when entire populations are being enslaved by environmental collapse? Your cautious approach has failed because it doesn't address the root cause, it doesn't address the systems of power that profit off of destruction. And that's where we differ. Kamala opened her mouth, ready to respond, but AOC didn't give her the chance. She raised a hand, silencing her opposition, and turned back to the audience. You can't be a champion of the people while coddling the industries that keep the status quo alive. It's not enough to say you're doing what you can. You can't call yourself a leader while being afraid to make the hard choices. AOC's words echoed through the room, powerful and undeniable. The crowd shifted once more. Kamala's face, once a picture of control, was now strained. She was struggling to hold on to her grip on the debate. For the first time, her argument was being picked apart, not just in terms of policy, but in terms of its moral integrity. I'm not here to play politics, AOC said, her voice softening slightly, but her eyes still blazing with passion. I'm here because the people who will be affected by this crisis, the people who will bear the brunt of your inaction, they don't have time for political games. They don't have time for compromise that does nothing but slow down progress. They need a future. And we can give it to them if we stop pretending that the system we've built is something worth saving. The audience was in a frenzy now. People were clapping, nodding, and standing in support. The room had shifted in AOC's favor, and Kamala's once unshakable confidence was visibly cracking. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she glanced over at AOC, her eyes narrowing, not with the confidence of someone on the verge of winning the debate, but with the frustration of someone who realized that the ground beneath her was slipping away. Kamala opened her mouth, her voice tight with the weight of what had just been exposed. You don't understand, Alexandria. But before she could finish, AOC cut her off, her tone quiet but resolute. No, Kamala. You don't understand. Kamala's face betrayed a flicker of doubt. Was she finally realizing the weight of the moment? For a brief second, the crowd held its breath. Was Kamala about to lose control completely? Had AOC done the unthinkable, undone the carefully built facade of compromise and caution? But then AOC turned back to the audience, her eyes scanning the room. This isn't just a debate. It's a turning point. We have a choice. We can keep pretending that the same policies will solve the crisis, or we can demand the radical change that will actually save lives. The choice is ours. The crowd erupted. Cheers filled the room, deafening, a chorus of support for AOC's message. Kamala stood there, frozen, caught in the storm that AOC had unleashed. It wasn't just a victory in the debate, it was the beginning of a shift. The weight of AOC's words had done more than dismantle Kamala's arguments, it had exposed a truth the world was finally ready to face. The debate had ended, but the storm it unleashed was just beginning. Within minutes of the event wrapping up, social media erupted. The hashtags flooded every platform. Hashtag AOC for the planet was everywhere, on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook. AOC's name was trending at the top, with millions of people sharing clips of her impassioned argument, her mic drop moments, and the devastating revelations that had rocked the political world. The clips were quick, punchy, and emotional. AOC had become the hero of the hour. The crowd's eruption in support of her felt like a collective declaration: we are done with compromise. We are done waiting. "Did you see that?" tweeted one user, the message quickly shared across the internet. AOC just dismantled Kamala Harris like it was nothing. This is why we need bold leadership. The reactions were immediate, visceral, and, for the most part, overwhelmingly in favor of AOC. Celebrities chimed in, praising her courage. Actress and activist Zoe Saldana tweeted, "If you're not with AOC on this one, are you even paying attention?" Meanwhile, comedian Hassan Minhaj added, "AOC put Kamala on blast with science and truth. That's how you do it, people." But it wasn't just the celebrities who were responding. Ordinary citizens, millions of them, took to their feeds with renewed energy. One user posted a video of themselves crying as they watched AOC's powerful speech, captioning it, "This is the kind of leadership we need. This is the leadership that gives us hope." Even environmental organizations, which had long pushed for more aggressive climate action, were quick to express their support for AOC's message. The Sierra Club tweeted, "This debate was a turning point. The fight for the future of our planet is on, and AOC is leading the charge. We need bold action, not more empty promises." The Energy Action Coalition added, "Today, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez made it clear, no more excuses. We have 10 years to save this planet. Time to act." The backlash against Kamala Harris was equally swift. Critics were relentless. The headlines began to shift. Instead of framing the debate as a moment of political discourse, the media quickly began to describe it as a clear demonstration of who was really ready to tackle the climate crisis and who was still stuck in the past. Kamala's approval ratings began to dip almost immediately. Polls conducted in the aftermath of the debate showed a marked shift. While she still held a significant portion of support, especially from the establishment and moderate factions, her standing with younger, progressive voters had taken a serious hit. The Democratic base was starting to wonder if she was truly the leader they needed to confront the existential crisis of climate change. On cable news, pundits debated the fallout. On one channel, a well-known commentator said, "Kamala Harris has always been known for her diplomatic approach, but today, she showed why that may not be enough. We saw AOC take the gloves off, and it's clear, America is ready for someone who isn't afraid to call out the system." The audience applauded. Meanwhile, in interviews across the country, AOC's support grew. A group of young climate activists, who had watched the debate together, took to the streets with homemade signs that read #AOC for the planet. AOC's supporters turned the rallying cry into a movement, organizing protests in key cities, demanding that the Senate and the White House take immediate, decisive action on climate change. Even within political circles, the debate continued to dominate. Allies of Kamala Harris began scrambling to reframe her position, highlighting her long history of legislative victories, her commitments to renewable energy, and the importance of bipartisan progress. But the narrative was already shifting. The message that AOC had driven home so powerfully, the climate crisis is urgent, and incremental change is not enough, was resonating across the nation, especially with younger voters. The more moderate, status quo approach of Kamala Harris, despite her experience, began to feel out of step with the growing intensity of the crisis. Her critics argued that she had spent too much time making deals with corporate interests and not enough time addressing the urgency of the situation. Meanwhile, AOC, who had entered the political arena as a fresh, uncompromising voice, was now being seen as the new standard-bearer of progressive climate action. The political ripple effect wasn't limited to social media. Political analysts began to question Kamala's political future. Would she adjust to the growing demands for bolder climate action, or would her reluctance to shift in the face of the crisis leave her increasingly irrelevant in a world demanding change? The questions echoed across Washington. Within days, various Democratic insiders began openly discussing the potential shift in power, wondering if AOC could be the force that would ultimately reshape the party's future, and its policies on climate. In the days that followed, Kamala Harris maintained a quiet public profile. Her team worked to reassess her political strategy. She knew the stakes had just changed. She had been caught off guard, but she wasn't about to let this moment define her. Behind closed doors, her advisors huddled together, drawing up new talking points, working to recalibrate the narrative. They knew they needed a new approach, something bold, something that would cut through the criticism and regain the confidence of the party. But Kamala wasn't done yet. Her next move, her response to the devastation AOC had just wreaked upon her carefully constructed image, would determine everything. The political world held its breath. Would she retreat into the shadows, allowing the shift toward radical change to leave her behind? Or would she fight back, with everything she had, to reclaim her position as the leader who could bridge the divide between progress and pragmatism? One thing was certain, the battle for the future of America's climate policy was far from over. And Kamala Harris, despite the shockwaves of the debate, wasn't about to back down without a fight. Her next move would leave the political world in shock. The debate was over, but the fight had just begun. For Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the victory on that stage was never about scoring political points, it was always about something far bigger. As the dust settled and the cameras dimmed, her message remained clear: the climate crisis wasn't just a political issue, it was a moral imperative that demanded immediate action, from every corner of society. AOC took to the podium one last time, her voice steady but unwavering, a beacon of conviction. The media was still buzzing, still dissecting every word, every gesture of the debate. But Alexandria knew this moment was only the beginning. She turned toward the audience, not as a politician trying to secure her place in history, but as a leader calling the people to rise up. Today, we've seen the best and the worst of what our politics has to offer, AOC said, her voice clear and resolute. Kamala Harris represents a generation of leaders who have fought to protect a broken system, one that has failed us on every level. Her approach is one of compromise, of careful negotiations with the very industries that have created the crisis we face. But let me be clear, the world doesn't need more compromise. It needs action. Bold, radical, transformative action. She paused, letting her words sink in. The crowd, though silent, was hanging on every syllable. This wasn't just a speech, it was a declaration, a call to arms. We've been told for too long that we can't change things overnight, she continued, her gaze sweeping across the room. That the best we can do is to nibble at the edges, make small adjustments, and hope it's enough. But it's not enough. The time for small fixes is over. The time for bold action is now. We need to be the change we want to see in the world, and that means demanding the impossible, because if we don't, there will be no world left to save. AOC's message wasn't just about the political class, it was about every person watching, every individual who believed in a future worth fighting for. She wasn't just calling for policy change, she was calling for a movement. She turned away from the podium briefly, letting the weight of her words echo through the room, before looking back at the camera. It's not enough to sit back and wait for someone else to make the change. It's not enough to hope the system will come around. We need to take the fight into our own hands. We need to rise up and demand the change that's been promised to us for generations, but never delivered. We need a Green New Deal. We need a radical shift that will transform not just our economy, but the very way we think about our future, about our children, about our planet. The crowd stood, erupting in applause, their voices a mixture of excitement, hope, and determination. AOC wasn't just a politician now, she was a symbol of a new, fearless generation demanding accountability. Meanwhile, across the political spectrum, Kamala Harris was watching, her face stoic but her mind racing. The backlash had been swift and sharp. Her once sturdy platform now felt like it was built on shaky ground. She had always believed that incremental change was the key, that compromise and collaboration would bring real progress. But the world had changed, and it wasn't waiting for her to catch up. Kamala sat quietly, thinking of the days ahead. She had seen the power of AOC's words, the way they had ignited a fire in so many people. She knew, deep down, that something had to change. Kamala had always been a pragmatist, but she wasn't blind. The world was in crisis, and no amount of careful negotiation would be enough to stave off the inevitable if they didn't act decisively. In the days following the debate, Kamala's team began to reassess her climate strategy. Conversations were happening behind closed doors. Adjustments were being made. The questions were being asked: could they take a bolder stance on climate action? Could they craft a policy that truly matched the urgency of the crisis? Kamala Harris knew that her political future depended on this shift. But more importantly, the future of the planet depended on it. The media landscape was still abuzz. Polls continued to shift in AOC's favor, but a new conversation was emerging. People were starting to talk about the role of government, not as the protector of status quo, but as the driving force behind radical transformation. It wasn't about left or right anymore. It wasn't about Democrats versus Republicans. It was about what's right for the planet. And for the first time in a long while, that meant embracing the bold, the revolutionary, and the inevitable truth: change had to come, and it had to come now. AOC's rise was more than just a political battle, it was the catalyst for something much larger. It was the spark that would ignite a global movement of people demanding change, demanding justice, and demanding a future that was worth fighting for. The political world had been shaken, but the fight for climate action was far from over. And in the end, that was the true victory. The future was in the hands of the people, and together, they would rise to meet the challenge. Because the world wasn't waiting. And neither were they. As the video ended, the final message appeared on screen: the future is in our hands. Let's fight for it. The moral of the story was clear: change may be hard, it may be uncomfortable, but it's necessary. The fight for our planet was no longer just about politicians in power. It was about every individual who dared to stand up and demand a world worth saving. Together, they could make the impossible possible. And that was just the beginning. The debate is over, but the fight for climate action is far from finished. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stood up for the bold change our planet desperately needs, and in doing so, she sparked a movement that's just beginning to gain unstoppable momentum. But this fight isn't hers alone. It's up to all of us, every one of us who knows that the time for compromise has passed. The question we're left with is simple: which side will you be on when the next debate begins? Will you stand with those who are still clinging to the past, unwilling to confront the scale of the crisis? Or will you join the call for radical action, demanding bold, transformative solutions that can save our planet and ensure a livable future for generations to come? This is the moment. The urgency is real. The future of our world depends on what we do right now. And you have the power to make a difference. If you believe in the fight for climate justice, if you believe that bold action is not only necessary but possible, it's time to get involved. Subscribe, share this video, and join the conversation. Let's make sure our voices are heard, because together, we are stronger than any political machine. The movement for climate action needs you. Whether it's spreading the word, rallying your community, or demanding accountability from your leaders, now is the time to act. Let's turn the tide on climate change. Together, we can make the impossible possible. Subscribe now. Share this message. And let's continue to fight for the future we deserve. The question remains: which side will you be on when the next debate begins? Let's make sure the answer is clear.